The kitchen
What
smelled
was
of
that
butter and
sound?
coffee,
They're
the
here.
kind of
We need to
simple
leave now.
morning warmth that
The
Thomas
back way.
Blake had
Let's
learned
go.
to appreciate in his 76 years. Outside, the November frost clung to the cornfields like old memories, refusing to fade.
Here you are, miss.
Inside,
Thank
his
you,
grandson
soldier.
Michael
It
stood at
smells
the counter,
wonderful.
15
Just
years
doing my
old,
part.
and
We
trying
all
his
are.
best to help with Thanksgiving breakfast preparations. Blake cracked eggs into a bowl, his weathered hands steady despite the arthritis that had crept into his joints. Farming and war had both taken their toll, but he could still make a decent breakfast. That much hadn't changed. "How do you want your eggs, Michael?" The boy looked up from the bacon he was arranging on a pan. "Scrambled, I guess." Blake's hands stopped moving. The spatula slipped slightly in his grip. For a moment, he was somewhere else entirely. A mess hall in Ohio. December 1944. A young woman frozen in terror before a serving counter, unable to answer the simplest question in the world. "Grandpa, you okay?" Blake blinked, returning to his kitchen, his grandson, his present. Yeah, I'm fine, just..." That question used to mean something different to me. Michael's adolescent curiosity sparked. War stories were rare from his grandfather, who usually deflected questions about his service with jokes about peeling potatoes and burning toast. "What do you mean?" Blake set down the spatula and pulled out a chair. His knees creaked as he sat, a sound as familiar as the sunrise. "You ever wonder what the war taught me, Michael Real, were not the movie version? I guess you never really talk about it. Most vets don't, but maybe it's time." Blake gestured for Michael to sit across from Peter. "Because that question you just answered without thinking, how do you want your eggs? There was a time when 45 women couldn't answer it, and teaching them how changed my life." Michael sat confused but intrigued. "It's just eggs, Grandpa." Blake smiled, the kind of sad smile that carries decades of weight. "That's what I thought too, son. But it was never just eggs. It was about something bigger, something the schools don't teach when they talk about D-Day and victory parades." He leaned back, letting his mind drift across 41 years of distance. December 1944, Camp Sherman, Ohio. I was 35 years old, and I thought I was just a cook. Turned out I was something else entirely. The old man's eyes grew distant, focusing on a past his grandson couldn't see. And slowly, carefully, he began to tell the story. Camp Sherman, Ohio. November 1944. The assignment came through on a gray November afternoon, the kind of day when the sky pressed down like a wet wool blanket. Sergeant Thomas Blake stood in the camp commander's office reading orders that made no sense. "Female prisoners, sir." Lieutenant Sarah Montgomery looked up from her desk. She was 29, Vassar educated and navigating a role the Army had never properly defined. 45 German auxiliaries, communication supply, kitchen staff. They'll arrive next week. Blake shifted his weight, favoring his good knee. The farm accident that had kept him stateside felt like a mark of shame. Real men fought, he cooked. "I wasn't expecting women, ma'am." "Neither was I, Sergeant, but war doesn't care what we expect." He studied the lieutenant's face, noting the tension around her eyes. She was worried about something she wasn't saying. In his 35 years, Blake had learned to read what people didn't say. The Iowa farm where he'd grown up taught patience and observation. You watched weather patterns, animal behavior, the small signs that told you what was coming. "You have concerns, ma'am." Montgomery hesitated, then spoke frankly. "I don't know how to handle this, Sergeant. Female enemy combatants. There's no manual, no protocol. We're making it up as we go." Blake nodded. He understood improvisation. "I'll do my best, ma'am." "I know you will. That's why you're assigned to this." As he left the office, Blake thought about the irony. He'd enlisted imagining frontline service, some tangible contribution to victory. Instead, he was about to cook breakfast for German women. It felt like the universe had a strange sense of humor. Walking back to the mess hall, he passed the barracks where the women would be housed. The buildings looked like every other military structure, functional and cold. He wondered what kind of women would emerge from those trucks next week. Would they be defiant? Broken angry? He had no way of knowing that they would be something far more troubling. Something that would force him to confront demons he'd been running from for 6 years. The memory of Sarah. That night alone in his quarters, Blake pulled out the photograph he kept in his footlocker. Sarah, at age 11, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a basket of eggs from their chicken coop. The photo was worn at the edges from handling creased, where his thumb always rested on her face. She would have been 18 now if she'd lived. The math was automatic, unavoidable. Every birthday that passed, he calculated the age she'd never reach. Sarah had died in 1938, 12 years old, a rare blood disorder the doctors couldn't quite name. They'd said she needed surgery, presented two options with complicated medical terminology that might as well have been foreign languages. Blake and his wife Joan had sat in that sterile office, terrified parents trying to understand the incomprehensible. "Which treatment do you recommend?" Blake had asked. The doctor, a tired man with kind eyes, had spread his hands helplessly. "Both have risks. Both have potential benefits. We need you to decide." Blake remembered the fear that had paralyzed him. What if he chose wrong? What if his decision killed his daughter? The weight of that choice had felt crushing, impossible. So he'd done what seemed safest at the time. "You're the experts. You decide." The doctors had chosen treatment B. Sarah had died 3 days after the surgery. The autopsy later suggested treatment A might have worked. Might have. The word haunted him more than certainty ever could. For 6 years, Blake had carried that guilt like stones in his pockets. He'd failed his daughter by refusing to choose, by abdicating responsibility for her life to people who didn't love her the way he did. He'd taken away her agency, her voice, her right to participate in decisions about her own body. His mother had taught him better. Growing up in Iowa, she'd always asked him and his siblings how they wanted things. "How do you want your eggs, Tommy?" It wasn't just about breakfast. It was about respect, about acknowledging that even children had preferences worth honoring. He'd forgotten that lesson when it mattered most. Now staring at Sarah's photograph, Blake whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry, baby girl. I should have asked what you wanted." The photo offered no forgiveness, no absolution, just a frozen moment of happiness that would never age. The arrival. The trucks came on a Wednesday, late November, snow falling like ish from a colorless sky. Blake stood at the mess hall window, watching 45 women descend into the camp. Even from a distance, something about them seemed wrong. They moved like machines. Precise, efficient, utterly devoid of the natural chaos that comes with being human. No one stumbled. No one looked around with curiosity or fear. They simply formed perfect lines and waited for instructions. Private Daniel Murphy, 21 years old and fresh from Boston, whistled low. "They're disciplined. I'll give them that." Blake didn't respond. He was studying their faces, or rather, the absence of expression on their faces. He'd seen wounded soldiers with that look, the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd witnessed too much. But these women weren't coming from frontline combat. They were auxiliaries, communications specialists, supply officers, kitchen staff. What had happened to them that left them looking so empty? Lieutenant Montgomery processed them with professional efficiency. Blake watched from his window as each woman stepped forward, answered questions, received assignments. Their responses came in flat, mechanical tones. No hesitation, no emotion, no trace of individuality. One woman in particular caught his attention. Mid-20s, blonde hair pulled back in regulation-style posture, rigid as a steel beam. When Montgomery asked her name, she responded like a recording. Claire Ashford, age at 24. Rank, communications auxiliary. The exchange had all the warmth of a census form. Blake felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't normal military discipline. This was something else. Something that reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah in her final days when the illness had stolen not just her strength, but her personality. That night, the women ate their first meal in the mess hall. Blake served standard POW rations, nothing fancy but adequate. He watched them file through the line, each taking whatever was placed on their trays without comment or question. They sat in perfect rows, ate in synchronized silence, and deposited their empty trays with mechanical precision. Not one of them smiled. Not one asked for seconds, though food remained. Not one showed any sign of preference or personality. Murphy cleaned tables nearby, clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. "Sarge, why are they so quiet? I mean, I know they're prisoners, but this is weird, right?" Blake nodded slowly. They've been taught that silence is survival. Question is, why did they need to learn that? The first week, Blake was a patient man. Farming taught you to observe before acting, to understand patterns before intervening. So he watched. He kept a small notebook jotting down observations that probably seemed paranoid to anyone else. Day one, no smiles, no eye contact between prisoners. Accept all food without reaction. Day 2. Eat everything on plates regardless of apparent preference. Never ask questions. Respond only when directly addressed. Day 3. Notice American soldiers discarding food. Several prisoners show visible distress but make no comment. 3 women drew his particular attention, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was his instinct for reading people honed through years of managing farmhands in military kitchens. Perhaps it was something deeper, some recognition of kindred spirits struggling with invisible wounds. The blonde woman Claire Ashford fascinated him. There was education in the way she held her fork, refinement in her posture that spoke of a life before the war. But her eyes were dead things, flat and distant. She took the smallest portions possible, ate with grim determination, and never once looked at the food as if it brought her any pleasure. The youngest one, a girl who couldn't be more than 19, had fury buried deep beneath her compliance. Blake learned her name was Emily Carson. She looked at the abundance of American food with something that might have been anger or perhaps grief. When she ate, it was mechanical, joyless. She was feeding her body while starving something deeper. The eldest, Dorothy Hayes, approached breakfast like a logistics problem. Blake recognized the type. She'd been a supply officer, he'd learned from the files. Now she calculated portion sizes with her eyes, assessing efficiency and waste with the same cold precision she probably once used for inventory management. All 3 were broken. All 45 were broken. But Blake didn't understand how or why until the incident on day 5. The waste. An American private, a kid from Texas who'd never known real hunger, scraped half a plate of eggs into the garbage bin. It was a thoughtless gesture, the kind of casual waste that happened 100 times a day in American mess halls. Blake happened to be watching Claire Ashford at that moment. He saw her entire body flinch as if struck. Her face contorted with something between pain and horror. She turned away quickly, one hand pressed to her mouth, and Blake realized with sudden clarity that she was fighting not to vomit. He approached carefully. "You all right, miss?" Claire couldn't speak. She shook her head, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. Blake followed her gaze to the garbage bin, to the perfectly good food being thrown away, and understanding crashed over him like cold water. They were starving in Germany, or they had been. And watching Americans casually discard what would have fed a family for days was physically painful to witness. Blake found Murphy in the kitchen. The German women, when they look at us throwing away food, they're not being judgmental. They're traumatized. Murphy, who was young but not stupid, absorbed this. Because where they're from, you don't waste anything. Because where they're from, there isn't anything to waste. Blake leaned against the counter, thinking, we need to help them understand there's enough. That abundance isn't obscene, but that's going to be harder than it sounds. Why? Blake thought about Sarah, about the hospital with its endless resources that still couldn't save his daughter, about how scarcity and abundance were both their own kinds of prisons. Because accepting that there's enough means accepting that what they suffered wasn't necessary. That's a hard truth to swallow. The decision. For 3 weeks, Blake observed and pondered. He studied these women like a farmer studies weather patterns, looking for the moment to act. Montgomery gave him space, trusting his instincts in a way that both honored and humbled him. It was Murphy who finally articulated what Blake had been circling. They never asked for anything, Sarge. Never expressed preferences. It's like they forgot how to want things. That was it. The core of the problem crystallized in that simple observation. They'd forgotten how to want. Or more accurately, they'd been taught that wanting was dangerous. Blake thought about his mother, about Sunday mornings in Iowa. How do you want your eggs, Tommy? Such a simple question, but it conveyed so much. It said you matter. Your preferences matter. You are an individual whose desires deserve respect. He thought about Sarah, about how he'd never asked her what she wanted, about how the doctors had presented options, and he'd been too afraid to choose, so afraid that he'd stolen her choice too. He couldn't save Sarah. That failure would haunt him until his own death. But maybe, just maybe, he could help these 45 women rediscover what had been stolen from them. Blake found Montgomery in her office. Ma'am, I want to try something. She looked up from paperwork. What kind of something, Sergeant? I want to ask them how they want their eggs. Montgomery stared at him for a long moment. That's your experiment, asking about breakfast preferences. Choices start small, ma'am. My mother taught me that respect begins with respecting small decisions. If we can help them choose how they want their eggs, maybe eventually they can choose who they want to be. Montgomery's expression softened. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is. Blake cleared his throat. I just think these women have been stripped of agency. Every choice made for them, every preference ignored. If we can give them back something small, something safe, maybe it's a start. And if it doesn't work, Blake shrugged, then I've wasted some eggs. But I don't think it'll be a waste, ma'am. Montgomery gave permission. Blake spent the next day preparing. He made 3 types of eggs, scrambled, fried, and boiled, displayed them clearly on the serving line. Murphy watched the elaborate preparation with bemusement. This is a lot of work for breakfast, Sarge. This isn't about breakfast, Blake replied. This is about dignity. December 14th, 1944. The morning arrived cold and bright. Blake stood behind the serving counter, heart pounding, in a way that it hadn't since his wedding day. This felt important in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like he was about to step over a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The women filed in at 0700, same as always. Perfect lines, expressionless faces, mechanical movements. Claire Ashford reached his station, first metal tray, held in regulation grip. Blake took a breath and asked the question that would change everything. How do you want your eggs, Miss Scrambled, fried, or boiled? Claire froze. Completely, utterly froze. The tray trembled in her hands, metal rattling against metal in the suddenly silent hall. Her eyes went wide, pupils dilating with something that looked horrifyingly like panic. Blake watched her face cycle through emotions in the space of 3 heartbeats. Confusion, fear, desperate calculation, paralysis, and underneath it all, shame. The kind of deep, corrosive shame that comes from being unable to perform a basic human function. Behind Claire, 44 women stopped moving. The ripple effect was instantaneous and eerie. One woman's inability to answer had frozen them all like they were connected by invisible wires. Blake felt his stomach drop. He'd broken something, or revealed how broken it already was. He tried again, gentler this time, as if speaking to a spooked horse. It's okay, miss. Just tell me which kind you'd like. There's no wrong answer. Claire's lips moved soundlessly. She was trying to speak. He could see the effort in the tension of her jaw, the working of her throat. But no words came. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. Murphy, standing nearby with a coffee pot, shot Blake a confused, worried glance. This wasn't what either of them had expected. Dorothy Hayes stepped forward from several places, back in line, trying to help or maybe trying to move things along. Blake turned his attention to her, hoping an older, more experienced woman might find this easier. How about you, miss? How would you like your eggs? Dorothy opened her mouth. I will have... She stopped. Started again. Please to give me... Another stop. Her carefully constructed composure began cracking at the edges. Her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white. The words existed. Blake could see that she knew them. That vocabulary wasn't the problem. But something else, something deeper and more fundamental, prevented them from emerging. It was like watching someone try to speak a language their mouth had forgotten how to form. Lieutenant Montgomery moved from her observation post near the door, recognizing crisis when she saw it. She approached with careful calm, speaking directly to Dorothy. Would it be easier if I just gave you a little of each kind? Then you can discover which you like best. Dorothy seized the compromise like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. Yes, thank you. That is acceptable. Montgomery gave Blake a meaningful look. He understood. Place mixed portions on the trays. Don't force the choice. Let them ease into it. One by one, the women came through the line. Each received scrambled, fried, and boiled eggs in small portions. Some looked relieved. Some looked ashamed. All looked exhausted, as if the encounter had drained something vital from them. Blake served them with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. Each "here you go, miss" felt weighted with significance. He was watching something profound and terrible unfold, witnessing damage so deep it had erased the ability to express preference. When the last woman had been served, when they'd all taken seats and begun eating with their usual mechanical efficiency, Blake stood behind the counter and fought the urge to put his fist through the wall. He'd thought he was being kind, thought he was offering dignity. Instead, he'd revealed an abyss of trauma he didn't know how to bridge. Murphy approached quietly. Sarge, what just happened? Blake shook his head. They've been taught that wanting things is dangerous, that choosing is wrong. And I just asked them to do something they've been punished for. So what do we do? I don't know yet. Blake watched the women eat, noting how some deliberately took bites of each type of egg, trying to perform the task they'd been given. But we keep trying because if we don't help them remember how to want things, how to choose things, what are they going back to after the war that night? Blake sat alone in his quarters, pen and handpaper before him. Letter writing had never come easily, but tonight words flowed like confession. Dear Joan, today I asked 45 women how they wanted their eggs. None of them could answer me. I kept thinking about Sarah, about how we didn't ask her what she wanted, about how we were so afraid of making the wrong choice that we made the worst choice possible, which was no choice at all. These German women, they're technically enemies. But Joan, when I looked at their faces today, I saw Sarah in that hospital bed. Powerless, voiceless, trapped in a system that didn't see her as a person who mattered. I think maybe God sent me here for a reason. Not to cook, not to serve my country in some glorious way, but to learn something, to face something I've been running from. These women have been stripped of agency so thoroughly, they can't even choose breakfast. And maybe, just maybe, helping them find their voices again can be my way of honoring Sarah, of giving other daughters what I failed to give mine. I don't know if I can do this, but I have to try. He sealed the letter, addressed it to their Iowa farm, and set it aside. Then he pulled out Sarah's photograph and studied it in the dim light of his quarters. I couldn't save you, baby girl, he whispered, but maybe I can save someone else. Maybe that's enough. The photograph offered no answer, frozen as it was in eternal childhood happiness. But Blake felt something shift in his chest. Purpose, maybe, or the first stirrings of redemption. Tomorrow he would try again. Different approach, gentler method, infinite patience. He would teach these women what his mother had taught him, that their preferences mattered, that wanting wasn't weakness, that choosing was the most human thing a person could do. It would take time, it would take care, it might not even work. But Blake had spent 6 years paralyzed by guilt and regret. Maybe it was time to choose action over paralysis. In a cold barracks across the camp, Claire Ashford sat on her bunk and stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The other women were silent, each processing the morning's incident in their own way. Some tried to dismiss it. Some felt shame. Some felt the first dangerous stirrings of hope. Emily Carson cried quietly into her thin pillow, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. Someone had cared what she wanted. Someone had noticed she was an individual. It hurt more than indifference ever had. Dorothy Hayes sat at a small table writing in a notebook Montgomery had provided. Her hand moved slowly across the page, forming words in careful German script. Today, an American sergeant asked me how I wanted my eggs. I could not answer him, not because I lack English vocabulary, but because I have forgotten how to want anything. When did this happen? When did I lose the part of myself that had preferences? And can I ever find it again? The questions hung unanswered in the cold air. But they had been asked, and asking was the first step toward answering. Outside, snow continued to fall on Camp Sherman, Ohio, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, 46 people, 1 sergeant, and 45 prisoners lay awake thinking about eggs and choices and the strangely powerful connection between the two. Tomorrow would bring new attempts, new methods, new small steps toward healing. But tonight, they each sat alone with the weight of what had been revealed. That simple questions could expose profound wounds. That breakfast could be revolutionary. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do for another person was ask them what they wanted and then wait patiently for them to remember how to answer. Blake fell asleep with Sarah's photograph on his chest, dreaming of Sunday mornings and second chances and the redemptive power of asking the right questions. Viet tiep part hai theodani, moi voyado di bongen to moi orchestrated condensed narrative balancing twists, climaxes, and character arcs. Michael leaned forward in his chair, teenage skepticism warring with genuine curiosity. So they couldn't answer. What did you do next? Blake stood slowly, returning to the stove where the eggs still waited. He cracked them into the pan with practiced efficiency, the sizzle filling the comfortable silence. I learned patience, Michael. Real patience. Not the kind where you're just waiting for something to happen. The kind where you create space for something to grow. He stirred the eggs gently, watching curds form in the butter. Took me 4 months to teach those women what you learned as a toddler. 4 months to help them remember they were people who could want things. 4 months just to ask about eggs. Blake smiled. 4 months to rebuild Soul's son. The eggs were just the tool. Camp Sherman, December 1944. The morning after the freeze, Blake changed his approach. No more direct questions. Instead, he became a narrator of breakfast, offering observations without demanding responses. Scrambled eggs came out particularly fluffy this morning, he'd say to no one in particular, serving mixed portions. Cold snap makes them rise better somehow. Or while placing fried eggs on a tray. Lots of the men prefer these on winter mornings. Something about the runny yolk. The women listened. He could see it in the slight tilt of their heads, the way their eyes tracked his movements. They were processing information, filing it away. Blake was teaching them the language of preference without requiring them to speak it yet. Murphy caught on quickly. The young private from Boston had the gift of gab, a trait that had probably annoyed his superiors before but served them well now. He started telling stories while serving food. "My ma, God rest her, she could never get scrambled eggs right," Murphy said one morning, his Boston accent thick and comfortable. "Always too dry. She'd beat 'em to death, you know, but her boiled eggs, now those were perfect. 3 minutes exactly. She had this little timer shaped like a chicken." A few women glanced up at this. The mundane domesticity of the story seemed to surprise them. Blake noticed Emily Carson, the youngest, watching Murphy with something that might have been interest. Murphy continued, oblivious, or pretending to be. "My brothers and me, we'd fight over who got the eggs with the runny yolks. Ma would make us take turns. Fair's fair, she'd say." Blake saw it then, the first crack in Emily's armor. Her lips moved slightly, forming words she didn't speak. He could almost read them, "My mother too, week 4. Progress came in increments so small they might have been invisible to anyone not watching carefully. But Blake watched like a hawk studies a field, noting every shift and change. Claire Ashford began taking slightly more scrambled than fried. Not by request, just by the way she positioned her tray, a subtle lean that Blake honored by adjusting portions. She never acknowledged it, but he noticed her eating the scrambled eggs first now with something that almost resembled interest. Dorothy Hayes started making eye contact when Blake served her. Brief, professional, but present. One morning she said, "More scrambled, please," and the simple sentence felt like a victory parade. Blake logged these small wins in his notebook the same way he'd once tracked crop yields in livestock health. Week 4, Dorothy requests. Claire shows preference through body language. Emily watches Murphy like he's speaking a language she remembers but can't quite access. Lieutenant Montgomery observed his methods with quiet approval. She'd started having her staff eat meals at tables near the German women, breaking down the physical barriers that reinforce psychological distance. Blake appreciated her trust, her willingness to experiment with dignity when regulations might have demanded rigid separation. One morning, Blake deliberately sat at a table adjacent to where Claire and several others ate their breakfast. The silence was initially oppressive, thick with discomfort. He simply ate his own eggs and toast, occasionally commenting on neutral topics. Snow's supposed to let up by afternoon. Coffee stronger than usual. New batch of beans came in. Small talk. Meaningless and profound all at once. He was modeling normal human interaction, showing them that conversation didn't have to carry weight or danger. After several minutes, one of the women, a thin brunette named Kate, spoke in heavily accented English. "Please salt." Blake passed the shaker. "Here you go." "Thank you." "You're welcome." 4 sentences, a complete social transaction. Kate looked stunned by her own boldness. The other women watched as if she'd performed a magic trick. Blake finished his breakfast and left without ceremony, but his heart was pounding. They were remembering. Slowly, painfully, they were remembering how to be human with other humans. The resistance. Not everyone would healing at the same pace. Blake had noticed Helen Bradford early on, a woman in her early 30s who carried herself with rigid military bearing that never softened. She organized a small group of about 12 women who ate together, spoke only German among themselves, and maintained deliberate distance from the Americans. When Blake asked Helen how she wanted her eggs, she always responded the same way: Whatever you choose is acceptable. There was defiance in her compliance, if that made sense. She was technically following instructions while simultaneously rejecting the premise. Blake found it fascinating and troubling in equal measure. He mentioned it to Montgomery during one of their evening debriefings. That Helen Bradford. She's different from the others. Montgomery's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. How so? The other women are thawing. Slow, but it's happening. Helen's frozen solid, and she's got followers. Blake stirred his coffee, thinking. Feels like she's running a resistance operation. Montgomery was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of classified knowledge. I received a file last week. Intelligence suggests one of our POWs might be SS, not regular auxiliary. Female officer who went underground assumed false identity. Blake absorbed this. You think it's Helen? I'm watching her closely, but Sergeant, if it is her, she's documenting everything. I've seen her with a notebook writing in what looks like code. What do you want me to do? Uh, Montgomery met his eyes. Keep doing what you're doing. If she is SS, if she is gathering intelligence, let her see exactly how we treat prisoners. Let her document kindness. That might be more powerful than any interrogation. It was a risky strategy, one that spoke to Montgomery's character. She believed in leading by example, even when the example was being recorded by enemy intelligence. Blake respected that, but he also started paying closer attention to Helen's group, to the dynamics playing out in German conversations he couldn't understand, but could read through body language and tone. January 1945. The letters arrived on a gray afternoon in mid-January, delivered with the International Red Cross in canvas bags that seemed far too small to contain so much potential joy and devastation. Montgomery distributed them during evening assembly, calling names while 45 women waited with expressions ranging from desperate hope to paralyzing dread. Blake helped with the distribution, watching faces as women received envelopes from home. Most clutched them like sacred objects. A few stared at their names written in familiar handwriting and seemed unable to breathe. Claire Ashford received 2 letters. Blake saw her hands shaking as she took them. She walked to a corner of the assembly hall and opened the first with surgical precision. Blake couldn't read German, but he could read body language. He watched Claire's face drain of all color. Watched her read the letter 3 times, each reading slower than the last, as if hoping the words would change. They didn't. She folded the letter carefully, precisely, then walked outside into the January cold without her coat. Blake gave her 5 minutes, then followed. He found her sitting in the snow behind the barracks, staring at nothing. Her lips were blue, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Miss Ashford, you'll freeze out here. She didn't respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice was utterly empty. I kept thinking I would go home after the war, that everything would be complicated but possible. Now there is no home to return to. Blake sat down beside her in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through his uniform. What happened? Dresden, October bombing. My parents were killed. My sister is missing, presumed dead. The neighbor who wrote says, our building is rubble. Everything is gone. The words came out flat, factual, as if she were reporting someone else's tragedy. Blake recognized the numbness. He'd felt it when they'd told him Sarah was dead. I'm sorry, he said, because there was nothing else to say. Are you? We were enemies. We did terrible things. Maybe this is justice, Mashish. Blake thought about that. No, this is just loss. There's no justice in children dying, buildings, burning, families destroyed. War does that. It's not righteous, it's just brutal. Claire finally looked at him. Why are you sitting in the snow with me, Sergeant Blake? Because I know what it's like, losing everything that matters. And then, for the first time since arriving at Camp Sherman, Blake told someone about Sarah, about the illness, the impossible choice, the guilt that had haunted him for 6 years. The words came easier than he'd expected, maybe because Claire's grief made space for his own. When he finished, Claire was crying silently, tears freezing on her cheeks. Your daughter, you couldn't save her. No, I couldn't, and I compounded that failure by not giving her a voice in her own treatment. I was so afraid of choosing wrong that I chose nothing. Took her agency away when she needed it most. They sat together in the snow, 2 people who'd lost everything that mattered, finding strange comfort in shared grief. Blake had no illusions that this conversation healed anything, But sometimes bearing witness to another person's pain was enough. Eventually, they went back inside. Blake made Claire hot tea with too much sugar. She drank it without comment, still numb, still processing. That night, Blake learned that Dorothy Hayes had received news that her family survived, but were living in a displaced persons camp. Her mother's letter explicitly begged her to stay in America, to not return to the ruins of Stuttgart. Emily Carson's mother was alive but starving in British-occupied Cologne, surviving on grass and hope. The letters had shattered whatever fragile equilibrium the women had achieved. That evening's dinner was silent in a different way than before. This wasn't the silence of compliance. This was the silence of grief. Blake served them, gently adding extra portions without being asked. When he got to Helen Bradford, she looked up at him and said, "Scrambled, please." No defiance, no resistance, just a woman too tired to maintain ideological purity in the face of collective mourning. Blake served her scrambled eggs and said quietly, "I'm sorry for whatever you learned today." Helen's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you, Sergeant." The secret Emily. Carson had started helping in the kitchen, a development Blake encouraged. She had a natural aptitude for cooking, and working with food seemed to give her purpose beyond mere survival. Murphy took her under his wing, teaching her American techniques, sharing stories about his mother's recipes. One morning, Emily came to Blake with worry creasing her young face. "Sergeant Blake, I must tell someone something, but I am afraid." They stepped into the dry storage room for privacy. Emily spoke in a whisper, glancing around as if the walls might report her. "There are 3 women, Ruth and Jane. They have scars, bad scars on arms and bodies. I saw by accident when Ruth was changing clothes." Blake felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of scars?" "Like medical, like experiments." Emily's hands twisted together. "I think maybe Ravensbrück. Before they join auxiliary. They beg me not to tell. They are afraid of more interrogation, more examination." Blake thought carefully. Those women had already been violated, used as objects for someone's twisted research. Reporting them to official channels would mean more interrogation, more being treated as specimens rather than people. It would undermine everything he was trying to build. "Can you get me a list of what medical supplies they need? Don't tell them it's from me. Just help them quietly." Emily nodded, relief washing over her face. "You will not report. Those women have been stripped of dignity enough. I'm not going to participate in that." Blake met her eyes. "But Emily, if any of them show signs of serious illness, I need to know." "Deal. Deal." Over the following weeks, medical supplies quietly disappeared from camp stores. Bandages, antiseptic pain medication. Blake signed for them without explanation, and Montgomery, who noticed everything, never asked. Some things were better handled through unofficial channels. The incident deepened Blake's understanding of what these women had endured. This wasn't just about military discipline or wartime propaganda. Some of them had been victims of systematic dehumanization that went far beyond anything he'd imagined. His question about eggs took on new significance. He wasn't just teaching them to express preference. He was helping them reclaim ownership of their own bodies, their own choices, their own humanity. February 1945. The newspapers arrived with photographs that would haunt Blake for the rest of his life. Allied forces were liberating concentration camps, and the evidence of systematic murder was undeniable. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, names that would become synonymous with horror. Montgomery made the decision to show the German women. Blake wasn't sure he agreed, but he understood her reasoning. They needed to know. They needed to confront what had been done in their country's name. The assembly hall was silent as Montgomery displayed photographs and read reports. Mass graves, gas chambers, skeletons in striped uniforms. The systematic murder of millions. Blake watched the women's faces. Shock, denial, horror, slow, terrible acceptance. Some cried, some sat stone-faced. All of them looked like they were being forced to swallow poison. Emily covered her mouth, looking ill. "We did not know. How could we know?" Dorothy's voice was harder. "But we should have known. The signs were there. We chose not to see." Helen Bradford said nothing. She sat absolutely still, face-pale hands gripping the edge of her seat until her knuckles went white. That evening, Blake overheard a confrontation in German that he couldn't understand, but the emotion was unmistakable. Dorothy was shouting. Helen was responding, voice breaking. Other women watched in tense silence. Later, Montgomery translated the essentials. Dorothy had challenged Helen, directly asking if she still thought that American kindness was manipulation. Helen had broken down. Blake found Helen alone outside the barracks an hour later. She was standing in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Miss Bradford. She turned to face him, and Blake saw that she'd been crying. I need to tell you something, Sergeant Blake. I owe you truth. All right. I was SS Obersturmführer, intelligence officer. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them too long. I was sent here to document American mistreatment of prisoners, to gather propaganda material. Blake absorbed this without visible reaction. And what have you documented? That you asked me how I wanted my eggs, that you treated us with dignity when you had no reason to, that you showed us kindness we never showed ourselves. Her voice cracked. I have been writing the truth, Sergeant, and the truth is destroying everything I believed. Blake was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Who do you want to be now, Miss Bradford? Helen looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. Someone worthy of the kindness you showed. Someone who tells the truth instead of hiding behind lies. Then that's who you'll be. Blake started to walk away, then turned back. Tomorrow morning when I ask how you want your eggs, I want a real answer. Not defiance, not compliance, just Helen Bradford making a choice about breakfast. The next morning, Helen approached the serving line with visible nervousness. Blake asked his question. She took a breath and answered, Scrambled, please? With cheese if you have it? Blake smiled. Coming right up, Miss Bradford. It was a small thing, trivial even. But in that moment, Blake watched a woman who'd spent years serving an ideology of hatred choose something as simple and human as how she wanted her breakfast. It felt like witnessing a resurrection. Progress. By late February, the transformation was undeniable. 41 of the 45 women could confidently state their egg preferences. Conversations happened at meals. Laughter, rare but real, occasionally echoed through the mess hall. Emily had taken over cooking eggs some mornings, asking Blake's question with gentle understanding of its weight. Women who'd been strangers had formed friendships. The rigid lines of compliance had softened into something more natural. Blake continued logging observations, but now they read differently. Week 12, Claire smiled today. Actual smile. Murphy made a joke about Boston winners, and she smiled. Week 14, Dorothy organizing informal English lessons for other women, teaching them to express preferences beyond food. Week 16, Helen approached me privately, asked if I thought she could be forgiven. Told her forgiveness isn't mine to give, but rebuilding is always possible. He shared these observations with Montgomery during their regular meetings. She'd started documenting the psychological rehabilitation program they'd accidentally created, thinking it might have applications beyond this one camp. You've done something remarkable here, Sergeant, she said one evening. Blake shook his head. I just asked about eggs, ma'am. You did more than that. You saw them as people when they'd forgotten how to see themselves that way. That's not a small thing. What to Iowa, 1985, Michael had been silent for several minutes processing the story. Blake scrambled the eggs, plated them, and set breakfast on the table. So the SS officer, she changed sides. She chose to be honest instead of loyal to a lie. That's not changing sides. That's changing yourself. Blake sat down across from his grandson. Helen Bradford went back to Germany, testified at tribunals, spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. Sent me letters until she died in 1970. What did the letters say? Blake pulled a worn envelope from his shirt pocket, always carried, always present. Last one she wrote. Read it. Michael unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Sergeant Blake, I am dying. Cancer. I wanted to write while I still can. You asked me 45 years ago who I wanted to be. I have tried every day since to be worthy of that question. Thank you for showing me that choosing goodness is possible, even after choosing evil. Thank you for the eggs. Helen. Michael handed the letter back with wet eyes. She remembered. They all did, son. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Choices matter. Small ones, big ones, they all matter. And sometimes the smallest choices teach us how to make the bigger ones. Blake took a bite of eggs, watching his grandson do the same. Now eat your breakfast. And remember that you chose scrambled. Remember that choosing is a privilege some people had to learn all over again. Outside, the Iowa morning brightened toward noon. Inside, two generations shared eggs and understood perhaps for the first time that breakfast could be about so much more than food. Viet Tiep, part Bathio, Dani Mo, o Dojai Bongen to Muiba Kong orchestrated comprehensive part by narrative structure with emotional climax and plot twists. Meitem Mokngin Chincham Bon Muilam. The news crackled through Camp Sherman's loudspeakers at 0600. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. Total. Final. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers erupted in celebration, whooping, hollering, embracing strangers. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that regulations clearly forbade, but no one cared about enforcing. Music played from somebody's radio. Victory, sweet and hard-won, filled the air like electricity. Blake stood in the mess hall doorway and watched 45 German women receive the same news in silence. They sat at their tables, breakfast growing cold in front of them, faces carefully blank. What did you feel when your country's defeat was the world's celebration, when your catastrophe was their triumph? He caught Claire's eye across the room. She looked lost, adrift in a way he recognized. The war had been terrible, but at least it provided structure, purpose, a framework for understanding the world. Now that framework had shattered and what came next was terrifyingly uncertain. That morning's breakfast was strange. Americans jubilant while German women moved through their routines like ghosts. Blake served eggs with his usual question, but the women's answers came mechanically distracted. Even those who'd learned to choose confidently seemed to have forgotten why it mattered. Murphy noticed it too. They should be relieved, right? Sarge, war is over. They get to go home. Blake shook his head. Home to what? Rubble and starvation and occupation. Dorothy's own mother told her not to come back. These women are celebrating nothing. So what do we do? Same thing we've been doing. Give them dignity, give them choices, let them figure out what comes next. But Blake felt time pressing down on him like physical weight. The war's end meant repatriation, separation, the dissolution of this strange community they'd built. He had maybe weeks left to finish what he'd started. Weeks to ensure these women didn't lose what they'd regained. The orders. Lieutenant Montgomery called Blake to her office 3 weeks after VE Day. Her face carried the expression of someone delivering news she wished she didn't have to share. Repatriation orders came through. Processing begins in 2 weeks. They'll go in waves as transport becomes available. Blake had known this was coming, but knowing didn't soften the blow. How long do we have? Most will ship out by late June, some might extend into July. Montgomery studied him carefully. You've become attached to them. I've become invested in their recovery, ma'am. That's different. Is it? Her expression softened. Sergeant, what you've done here matters. These women are going back different than they arrived. You gave them something they can take with them, or something that'll make readjusting harder. Choice and autonomy aren't valued where they're headed. Montgomery had no answer to that. Neither did Blake. They sat in uncomfortable silence, both understanding that their carefully constructed experiment was about to collide with a reality that didn't care about psychological rehabilitation or dignity or scrambled eggs. Blake spent that night thinking about endings, about Sarah's funeral where he'd been too numb to cry on, about saying goodbye to his Iowa farm when he enlisted uncertain if he'd return, about all the ways loss sneaks up and sucker punches you, even when you see it coming. He pulled out his notebook, reading through months of observations. The progression from mechanical compliance to genuine choice was documented in hundreds of small details. He'd watched women become people again, one breakfast at a time. Now they'd return to a world that had no use for people, only survivors. The final gift. Blake made a decision. If he only had 2 weeks, he'd make them count. He requisitioned extra supplies, calling in every favor he'd accumulated over months of running an efficient mess hall. Fresh fruit appeared rare and precious. Real butter, not the margarine substitute they usually served. Bacon that hadn't been frozen and thawed 3 times. Coffee beans that still smelled like heaven. Murphy watched the preparations with knowing eyes. Going out with a bang, Sarge. Going out with dignity, Blake corrected. Want them to remember that even as prisoners, even as enemies, they were treated like human beings who mattered. But food was only part of it. Blake had something else planned, something more personal. He visited the camp supply office and requisitioned 45 small leather notebooks. Nothing fancy, just simple journals with blank pages. Then he spent 3 evenings writing his farmer's handwriting, cramped but legible, filling the first page of each notebook with a personal message. For Claire, whose parents died in Dresden and who learned to smile again. For Emily, who cried the first time someone asked what she wanted. For Dorothy, who turned choosing breakfast into teaching others about autonomy. For Helen, who chose truth over ideology. 45 women, 45 messages, each one acknowledging who they'd been and who they'd become. The hardest message was Claire's. Blake rewrote it 4 times before getting it right. He wanted to tell her about Sarah, about how helping these women had given him something he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose, redemption, a reason to believe that choice mattered even when the outcome was uncertain. On the final page, he wrote in careful block letters, Sarah Blake, born 1926, died 1938. She never got to choose. You did, honor that. He sealed each notebook in brown paper, addressed them in his careful script, and set them aside for the final breakfast. Montgomery found him in the mess hall late one night, surrounded by wrapped packages. You're going to break their hearts, Sergeant. Better broken hearts than forgotten humanity, ma'am. She nodded slowly. I'm recommending you for commendation. What you've done here, it should be studied, replicated. Blake shook his head. This wasn't about protocol or procedure. It was about seeing people as people. You can't replicate that. You can only choose it every single time. June 20th, 1945. The final breakfast arrived with early summer sunshine streaming through mess hall windows. Blake had prepared a feast by military standards. Eggs cooked 6 different ways, fresh fruit salad, toast with real strawberry jam, bacon crispy enough to shatter, coffee rich and dark. The women entered at 0700, same as always, but nothing about this morning was usual. Blake saw tears before the first tray was filled. These women understood endings. They'd survived enough of them. They'd survived. Claire approached first, as she often did. Blake asked his question one last time. How would you like your eggs, Miss Ashford? Her voice came clear and strong. No hesitation, no fear. Scrambled, please, with cheese. Then she did something that broke protocol completely. She met his eyes and said, Thank you, Sergeant Blake, for everything you taught us here. Blake felt his throat tighten. You taught me too, Miss Ashford, about courage, about what it means to keep choosing even when everything's uncertain. Dorothy came next. Fried, please, over easy. No hesitation, no calculation, just a woman who knew what she wanted and asked for it. Emily requested soft-boiled 3 minutes, exactly remembering Murphy's stories about his mother. The young private serving coffee nearby had tears streaming down his face that he didn't bother hiding. One by one, 45 women stated their preferences clearly, confidently, humanly. Blake served each one with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. Each "Here you go, miss" carried the weight of goodbye. Helen Bradford came last. She stood before Blake and said, Scrambled with cheese, please, Sergeant Blake. Then quietly, so only he could hear, I'm going back to testify. To tell the truth about what we did and what you showed us. Maybe that's my scrambled eggs, my choice. Blake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He served her eggs and watched her carry her tray to a table where former resistance members now sat integrated with the others. The meal lasted longer than usual. No one wanted it to end. Americans sat with Germans talking, laughing, crying. Murphy told stories. Montgomery shared hopes for their futures. The boundaries between captor and captive had dissolved into something more complicated and more true. When the women finally filed out, each paused in the doorway, looking back at the ordinary room that had changed everything. Blake watched them go and thought about Sarah, about how she never got to pause in doorways or look back at ordinary rooms. These women were doing it for her. The transport trucks arrived at 1400. Blake stood with Montgomery and Murphy, watching 45 women pack canvas bags with their few possessions. Each had received their wrapped package that morning. Most clutched them like sacred objects. Claire approached Blake's package under her arm. What's inside? Don't open it until you're on the ship. Promise me. I promise, and she hesitated, then asked, Why were you so kind to us? We were enemies. Blake thought about all the answers he could give, about Sarah, about redemption, about his mother's lessons from an Iowa farm. In the end, he settled on the simplest truth. Because someone should have been kind to my daughter and wasn't. Because kindness isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. Claire's eyes filled. I will remember you, Sergeant Blake. All of us will. The women boarded trucks in the same order they'd arrived, but everything else was different. They moved with purpose, now with presence. They said goodbyes that mattered. They cried without shame. Helen Bradford shook Blake's hand formally. I choose to be honest from now on. That's what you taught me. Emily hugged Murphy, breaking every regulation. You are a good man like your mama taught you. Dorothy saluted Montgomery with respect between equals. Thank you for showing us what's possible. Blake watched the trucks roll through the gates and down the Ohio road until they disappeared. Murphy stood beside him, openly weeping. Montgomery maintained composure, but her eyes were bright. Think they'll be okay, Sarge? Murphy asked. Blake didn't have an answer. He hoped. He believed. But he didn't know. Atlantic Crossing. Claire waited 3 days before opening Blake's package. She sat on her bunk in the crowded ship surrounded by women trying to sleep or pray or simply endure. The Atlantic was rough and many were sick. Claire felt nauseous, but not from the waves. She unwrapped the brown paper carefully. Inside was a leather notebook and a letter in Blake's handwriting. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Dear Miss Ashford, this notebook is for recording your preferences, thoughts, and individual self. Never forget that what you want matters. I had a daughter once, Sarah, 12 years old when she got sick. Doctors gave us options for treatment, asked my wife and me to choose. We were terrified. We said, you decide, you're the experts. They chose wrong. Sarah died. I learned too late that choosing is painful, but refusing to choose is worse. That not choosing is still a choice, just the cruelest kind. You froze when I asked about eggs because you'd been taught that choosing was dangerous. I understood because I'd taught myself the same lesson. Don't choose, can't fail. But we were both wrong. Not choosing didn't protect me from loss. It just added guilt to grief. I didn't give Sarah a voice when she needed one most. You found your voice again. You learned to choose scrambled with cheese. That sounds small, it isn't. It's everything. Keep choosing, Miss Ashford, even when it's hard, and especially when it's hard. Choose what you want for breakfast and who you want to be and how you want to live. That's how you honor people who can't choose anymore. That's how I honor Sarah, by helping you, with respect and hope for your future. Sergeant Thomas Blake, peace. Check the first page. Claire turned to the first page with trembling hands. Blake's handwriting filled it. June 20th, 1945. Claire Ashford chose scrambled eggs with cheese. She chose clearly, confidently, humanly. She is free. Claire read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Around her, other women were opening their own packages, reading their own messages. The ship filled with the sound of women crying and laughing and understanding finally what they'd been given. Dorothy found Claire an hour later. He gave us more than notebooks. I know. Claire clutched the letter to her chest. He gave us permission to be ourselves again. Emily appeared with her message clutched in her hands. He wrote about his daughter, about choices, about... She couldn't finish overcome. The 3 women sat together on Claire's bunk, sharing their letters, their grief, their tentative hope. They were heading back to a destroyed country with an uncertain future. But they had something now they hadn't had before. They had the knowledge that they could choose. And that knowledge changed everything. 3 paths. Hamburg Harbor was rubble and ruin when they arrived. The women were processed by British occupation forces, interrogated about Nazi Party membership, given options that weren't really options, returned to hometowns that might not exist, enter displaced persons camps, wait for families that might be dead. Dorothy Hayes chose to return to Stuttgart. She found her mother in a DP camp, thin but alive. Together, they rebuilt. Dorothy became a teacher using Blake's lesson about choices in every class she taught. She married a fellow teacher in 1950, had 2 children, 4 grandchildren. She wrote to Blake for 40 years, letters crossing the Atlantic, to an Iowa farm, sharing the life she'd chosen. Helen Bradford volunteered to testify at war crimes tribunals. She spent 3 years giving depositions telling truth about SS operations and about American treatment of prisoners. They showed us kindness we never showed ourselves, she testified. One sergeant asked how I wanted my eggs and meant how did I want to live. She died in 1970, her final letter to Blake, thanking him for showing her that redemption was possible. Emily Carson did something different. 3 months after arriving in Hamburg, Dorothy received a letter postmarked New York City, inside Emily's confession. I didn't stay in Germany. I chose differently. When the ship returned to America, I hid. I came back illegally. I'm here working in a restaurant kitchen in Manhattan. My mother knows, she approves. She says better I'm safe and illegal than starving and legal. I'm choosing every day, Dorothy. I'm choosing life. Don't tell Montgomery. But know that I'm using everything Sergeant Blake taught me. I'm free. Dorothy never reported her. Choice, after all, meant respecting other people's choices. Iowa, 1985. Michael had been quiet for 10 minutes processing everything. Blake sipped cold coffee and waited. Teaching meant knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. What happened to them, Grandpa, after? Blake smiled. Let me show you. He retrieved a wooden box from his bedroom, worn smooth from handling. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, 40 years of correspondence from 3 women in 3 cities. Dorothy taught English in Stuttgart until she retired in 1980. Still writes every Christmas. Emily opened a restaurant in New York called The Morning Choice. Became a citizen in 1960 when they granted amnesty. Has 3 kids, 7 grandkids. Visited me once in 1978. And Claire? Claire married an American soldier, moved to Chicago, became a translator, worked with refugee organizations. Used that notebook I gave her until it fell apart, then started another. Taught her children to keep choice journals. Blake pulled out a photograph. 3 women at a farmhouse table taken in 1962. Claire, Emily, and Dorothy together for the first time since 1945. They were smiling, eating scrambled eggs Blake had made. They came here, 20th anniversary of the egg question. They wanted to thank me in person. Blake's voice grew thick. Brought their families. Watched their kids choose how they wanted their eggs without thinking about it. That was the gift, Michael. Not just teaching them to choose, but knowing their children would never forget how. Michael studied the photograph. You saved them. Blake shook his head firmly. No, I asked them a question. They saved themselves by learning to answer it. Big difference. But it mattered. What you did mattered. It mattered because they let it matter. Because they chose to remember instead of forget. Chose to rebuild instead of surrender. Blake took the photo back, running his thumb over familiar faces. Sarah never got those choices. But helping 45 other daughters get theirs, maybe that's enough. The final breakfast. Outside, the Thanksgiving meal was waiting. Blake's daughter, Sarah's younger sister born after the war, was setting the table. Her children, Michael and his siblings, were arguing good-naturedly about who would carve the turkey. Blake stood slowly, joints creaking, and made his way to the kitchen. 4 generations would eat together today, and at the start of the meal, he'd ask the same question he'd asked for 41 years. How do you want your eggs? Some would answer scrambled, others fried. A few liked them poached or soft-boiled. It didn't matter which they chose. What mattered was that they could choose, that the question was asked with respect, that their preferences were honored. Michael followed him to the kitchen. Grandpa, can I ask you something? Course, son. If you could go back, if you could choose differently with Sarah, would you? Blake thought about that. I'd ask her what she wanted. I'd give her a voice in her own treatment. Beyond that, he shrugged. Maybe she still would have died, maybe not, but at least she would have chosen her own path. That's what the war taught you about choices. The war taught me a lot of things, most of them terrible. But 45 German women taught me that choosing is what makes us human. That taking away someone's ability to choose is the cruelest thing you can do. And that giving it back, even something as small as breakfast preferences, can change lives. Blake cracked eggs into a bowl, the same motion he'd made thousands of times. Now help your old grandpa make scrambled eggs. Family tradition. As they cooked together, Blake thought about Claire reading his letter on a ship crossing the Atlantic, about Dorothy teaching German students that choices matter, about Emily hiding in New York choosing life over law, about Helen testifying to truth instead of defending lies, about Sarah who never got to choose but whose memory had somehow redeemed 45 strangers. The eggs sizzled in the pan. The farmhouse filled with the smell of butter and coffee and family. Outside, Iowa winter waited with patient cold. Inside, Thomas Blake, 76 years old, and carrying 41 years of remembered faces, scrambled eggs, and understood that sometimes the smallest questions hold the largest truths. How do you want your eggs? It was never just about breakfast. It was about dignity, autonomy, the fundamental human right to want something and have that wanting matter to someone else. Blake had spent 4 months in 1944 teaching that lesson. And 41 years later, it still felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. "Ready, Grandpa?" Michael asked. Blake smiled, spatula in hand, ready to serve his family, ready to ask the question, ready to honor whatever answers they gave. "Ready, son, let's eat." And somewhere across the ocean in Stuttgart, in New York, and Chicago, three women sat down to their own Thanksgiving meals. They chose how they wanted their eggs without hesitation. They taught their children to choose. They remembered a sergeant in Ohio who'd asked a simple question and waited patiently while they learned to answer. They were free, and freedom they'd learned started with scrambled eggs and a man who believed their choices mattered. It always had been. It always would be. As simple and profound as that.